Wow, I just stand up here and everybody goes quiet. Cool. Good evening. I am Patty Sternberg, President of the Society for Contemporary Art. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Chicago and Berlin-based artist Julia Phillips. This program is generously sponsored by Prada. Before we delve into tonight's program, I'd like to celebrate the success of our year-end SCA member programs, including a special exhibition preview at Andrew Rafit's Gallery on December 15th as part of the gallery's grand reopening, as well as a closing reception of the performance Encyclopedia of Relations at the Renaissance Society. Looking ahead, please mark your calendars for February 28th, when we will host the Artists Collective New Red Order for a public lecture right here at the museum at 6 p.m. in Fullerton Hall. New Red Order is a public secret society facilitated by core contributors Jackson Paulus, Adam Khalil, and Zach Khalil. The collective works with networks of informants and accomplices to create grounds for the indigenous futures. Following the lecture, we invite you to join us for a dinner with the artists at Il Porcellino. Additionally, I encourage you to subscribe to our mailing list at scaic.org and join our membership for announcements about upcoming winter and spring season programming. This will include detailed information about exciting upcoming lectures by Guatemala City-based performance artist Regina Jose Galindo on March 6th, and Brooklyn-based artist, writer, and educator Stephanie Jemison on April 24th. It is also a great way to learn about our SCA special member programs, including collection tours, exhibition previews, and social happy hours. The SCA is actively seeking new supporters, whether you're on an individual or a corporate partner, to sponsor upcoming public programs and member events. Lastly, we offer reduced memberships. Apply on our website or simply scan the QR code on the screen. And your support is crucial for us to achieve our mission, and I hope you consider becoming part of the SCA family. Without further ado, I invite our SCA programming chair, Jessica Diamond, to introduce our special guest. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Patty, and welcome to all of you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are honored to introduce a special SCA friend, the remarkable artist, Julia Phillips. Julia draws inspiration from everyday tools and functional objects. Her sculptures are metaphors for social and psychological experiences. Laden with symbolic meaning, her art delves into the dynamics of power, whether between individuals or between an individual and an institution. Her exploration extends beyond sculpture to encompass drawings, print, and videos where the human body becomes a central theme. She sees the body as a symbol, a visual gateway to understanding psychological, social, and emotional experiences that may differ from ours. Born in Hamburg in 1985, Julia now lives and works in Chicago and Berlin. She is currently the assistant professor of visual arts at the University of Chicago. She has had a one-person exhibition at MoMA PS1 in New York, the Kunstverein in Braunschweig in Germany, and was featured in the Berlin Biennale and the New Museum Triennial. Her work has been shown at museums including the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Musée d'Art in São Paulo, the Studio Museum in Harlem. Phillips was included in the 59th Venice Biennale's Central Exhibition, The Milk of Dreams, curated by Cecilia Alamani. She recently published her first book entitled Energy Exchange, featuring artwork created over the last decade. And now, please join me in warmly welcoming Julia Phillips to the stage.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for this invitation to speak about my work. It's really meaningful, actually, to be able to introduce my work here in the city that I live and work in. I'd like to use this opportunity to introduce you to my work by speaking about 5 recent shows that all have been created since moving here to Chicago. And I'll be speaking about them chronologically. The first show we'll be looking at is Fake Truth, Witness 1 to 3, from 2019 that I showed at Kunstverein Braunschweig in Germany. Kunstverein Braunschweig in Germany is housed in an 1805 merchant villa. The small adjacent building that you see on the bottom right is the former horse stable that is now used for single projects by emerging artists. This is where I was invited to show. The size of the venue seemed well suited for an installation that would fill up the entire space. And before receiving the invitation in the summer of 2018, I had already started conceptualizing a project that was influenced by the political climate of that time in the United States, which was fake news. I was interested in the new destabilization of truth, which no longer was discussed as something objective or fact-based. And at the same time, as is the nature of my work, I was looking at the structural political phenomenon on a smaller and an interpersonal scale. I was doing research on the psychological effects caused by the denial of truth and memory. I didn't know what shape the work would take, but I knew I wanted to work with audio and with the sounds that viewers would produce, including their voices. I came up with the concept of 3 witnesses that would confirm an event or would confirm truth in the room. I thought about the role of a witness in the legal system and how it is used to give dimension and objectivity to the subjective perspectives of the opposing parties. The video I'm about to play is about 3 minutes long and serves as a documentation of the work. In the following slides, I'll walk you through some material choices and how I came to the form of this work. The materials included are glazed ceramics, audio cables, cardioid microphones, contact microphones, speakers, a subwoofer, gravel, and miscellaneous technology. When planning the project, I had just recently completed a sculpture that was suspended from the ceiling. Having wires go all the way up to the ceiling allowed me to connect the scale of human form to the scale of the architecture. So for Fake Truth, Witness 1, 2, 3, I wanted to work with suspension again. The cardioid microphone at mouth height was planned to capture voices, while contact microphones that were connected to the ground underneath each of the 3 sculptures amplified the gravel being moved around by the viewer's steps. Here an image of the technology, for which I collaborated with sound engineer Ken Kleemeyer. The voices were played out of stereo speakers, and the steps were played through a hidden subwoofer mounted underneath the ceiling. The lung pair lent itself nicely to hiding the stereo speakers within. In my work, there's often an interest in the medical world and the body as an object in a certain physical condition. I layered glazes as a way to complicate the skin surfaces and to underline these 3 figures as subjective entities or witnesses with their own histories. They vary in features such as complexion, height, and hair texture. Some show scars or ruptured elements. And the last aspect of the work that I want to speak about here is the development of the audio filters. Each sculpture's cardioid input was rendered through a filter and reflected sound back in different ways. The first witness simply has a time delay, so it accounts accurately but late. The second witness renders everything into a monotone, almost robotic sound and dismisses all intonation. And the third witness oscillates somewhat unpredictably between a high and a low pitch interpretation of the input. This interest in truth and subjectivity, as well as internal organs, is something that carried into the next body of work that I'd like to discuss. My first solo show at Matthew Mark's gallery in 2020, titled New Album. I wanted to create a shift in tone from previous works that were dealing with violence and oppression and physical force. In this show, I wanted to complicate a portrayal of subject-object relationships, with some works still showing a doer, done-to dynamic, while others would include a third party or implied actions of reconciliation. The first piece of this show I would like to discuss is Mediator, which in fact got acquired by the Art Institute in 2021. What you're looking at are 2 chest casts that are slightly tilted towards one another and a ceramic cast of a microphone mesh. The microphone here appears as a symbol of both absorption and amplification, 2 qualities needed for successful mediation or in the attempt of hearing one another. While both chest casts show fleshy insides, the exteriors are glazed in different skin tones. I was intending to point to colorism and a body's complexion as an identity marker that is not necessarily tied to one's ethnicity, while having power dynamics embedded in it. The tilted casts are meant as a symbol for confrontation, though with the microphone as a third party and witness in between. Here are reference images for the movement of 2 parties rotating around a shared center. Here another work, Negotiator. I was interested in the act of negotiation and the fragility of such an interaction. The spokes of the wheel bearing the weight are cast out of ceramics and glazed in fleshy tones, representing the emotional element of this act. I was curious to present negotiation as something that is more complex than winning or losing, with a mechanical joke built into it. If operated, neither of the opposing parties would be able to turn the wheel past 180 degrees. The third piece of the show is titled Observer. It's a binocular-like ceramic shape that suggests it could be utilized from either side. Both vertical sides are face casts of the eye section and have holes that align so viewers in the gallery can look through the volume. In this work, I was interested in the dynamic between the observer and the observed, and the power dynamics that can be embedded in the act of looking. On one hand, I was inspired by psychoanalytic theory that explores the gaze as a subject-object relationship. And on the other hand, I was inspired by post-colonial theory that contextualizes the gaze under the lens of surveillance. The last piece of the show in this installation is an installation that consists of 4 parts. It is titled Oppressor with Soul in Treatment and Suppressor with Spirit in Treatment. The work is a proposition for different kinds of treatment for the mind. This head-shoulder cast embodies oppressive forces with a head tilted downward as if literally oppressed from above, with a broken, ruptured soul that is presented on a medical dish. This second head-shoulder cast embodies the suppressive force, a head drastically tilted upwards as if in avoidance, with a ruptured spirit. And I refer to the soul and the spirit as imaginary organs, and they draw their inspiration from just an intuitive creative process, but also symbolism from within spiritual practices. My continued interest in subjectivity, as well as an interest in spirituality, informed my next body of work that I'd like to discuss, my presentation at the 2022 Venice Biennale. I presented my work in the Central Pavilion in the Giardini. Given the opportunity to exhibit to such a large audience, I created a suite of works and introduced new materials and a new concept. This time I wanted to focus on internal relationships or relationships with the self. When I moved from New York to Chicago in 2018, I had become interested in spiritual practices, particularly Vedantic studies, the philosophical part of Hinduism. Interestingly enough, the place where we are situated right this moment is not just known as Michigan Avenue, but also carries the honorary name Swami Vivekananda Way. In fact, when entering the Art Institute through Michigan Avenue, there is a small space, or when you exit, you'll face it right there, with a plate on the wall about Vivekananda's connection to and influence in Chicago. Vedanta is a knowledge and scripture-based practice that addresses the relationship one has with oneself in a lot of the teachings. When I was preparing and conceptualizing my presentation for Venice, I thought of the historical presence of spirituality there and the role of churches and the architecture of cathedrals. I was particularly interested in the floors of the interiors, in this case, the San Giorgio Maggiore church. Historically, there is a strong Islamic influence in Venice that introduced certain aesthetic elements to the region, such as these geometric tile patterns. The architecture of churches with the overwhelming ceiling height and the focus on the ground is something that interests me in relation to spiritual practice and the cultivation of humility. For the work Bauer, I had a granite stone base fabricated, replicating the tile pattern of San Giorgio Maggiore on a smaller scale. Bauer appears as an apparatus that can be activated by one person. The ceramic casts mark a forehead on the top and a lower back hip region on the bottom as a central joint in the movement of bowing. Here you see a sketch with a person standing within the device. I was interested in bowing as a gesture of humility, a physical lowering of the ego facing the ground. Here a detail shot of the bronze construction with the springs suggesting attention throughout the movement. Another church I was inspired by is St. Mark's Basilica. One of the floor sections has a circle consisting of a triangular pattern that became the inspiration for a marble base that I made for another work titled Veil Purifier that has a mauve-colored silk veil attached to it. I was interested in the complex role of a veil and how it can be a symbol of purity that appears in different cultures. And at the same time, the veil is such a strong symbol of oppression, with religion and patriarchy as some of the oppressive forces behind it. For this context, though, I used the veil as a marker of an internal and introverted gaze. I made a sculpture titled Purifier before that was not veiled and that emphasized the forehead, particularly the third eye position between the eyebrows, as a symbol of spiritual consciousness. I brought the shape into the veiled version, and the bronze armature mimics arms reaching through the veil. Leading up to the last piece of this suite, I'm showing this piece for reference. It's an object that I made in 2018 called Destabilizer. I used the split soles of feet as a physical metaphor for instability. So, like in the previous two works, Stabilizer has a relationship to the ground as well. Though this walking cane-inspired object is wall-mounted, it has an architectural plumb attached to it, literally grounding the triangular foot. The plumb is used in construction to determine the accurate vertical. For the glass case, I collaborated with designer Casey Lurie, who designed the case based on a geometric concept. I wanted the case to give the object a presence that resembles a relic and an object of worship. Here's some install shots where you can see the relationship between the works. The interest in internal relationships and an inward-facing gaze was carried on in the next show that I'd like to discuss, a solo show I did shortly after the Venice Biennale in September 2022, titled Me, Ourself, and You, that was shown at Matthew Mark's gallery. The show was composed of works that were a response to longed-for and early motherhood in various facets. One component of the show was a series of oil pastels titled Conception Drawings that I made between 2020 and 2021 while anticipating conceiving. The drawing process was as much a contemplation on the imagined insides of the body as it was an inquiry about medical but also mysterious processes that happen biologically. The uncertain aspect is represented by the question mark after the title of each drawing, and I'm here kind of gonna walk you through them. I went into the series wanting to articulate the separation between the pregnant person and the embryo or the fetus. I was trying to draw borders, but also enclosures and passageways, curves that could be the inside of the body or negative space. So this first one is titled Within Between, where you already see a border. I'm using my cursor here. A border and possibly a passageway right here. The next one is titled Tissue, where you see a potential tube and an opening and these round shapes kind of butting up against each other. This one is Tube, Suck, Float. And again, the beginning of a tube as a recurring shape and funnels. And this shape right here represents biomaterial being sucked or floating from one sphere into the next. This one is titled Ovulation / Eisprung. Eisprung is the German word for ovulation and literally translates to egg jump. So this little yellow element right here resembles maybe an egg, and this ovaries, and then again like a tube-like cord. And I felt like it had kind of a rotational movement to it, maybe reminiscent of an ultrasound. This one is titled Any Egg for a Big Flush, and I was asking myself, where do eggs live? And then obviously in ovaries, but I thought maybe they're held on kind of branches, anxious that they could be empty. And this flush represents the fertilizing component. This one titled Soft Tubes. Again, tubes as passageways and spaces of transition. This one is implantation, where you see maybe a cell accumulation right here and a kind of docking onto tissue. And this one is titled Cell Accumulation / Embryo, maybe the most articulated shape of an embryo with the potential head curve here and then like a little spine curve here. And I was wondering about the space or the tissue and structure where it lives. While making these drawings, I was planning and then eventually teaching the first iteration of my seminar called Intuitive Form. In that class, we read texts about intuition as part of the creative process and draw and sculpt under prompts as very shortly timed exercises. My making process for the drawings was based on intuitive and rapid gestures. The oil pastels I was using were diluted with vegetable oil, and the marks I made with my fingers and arms slid smoothly across the synthetic surface of the Duralar. I was always going after shapes and textures that I didn't plan beforehand, which is what we worked towards in my seminar as well. And all the titles and descriptions that I had read out to you were added to the works after completion in an associative manner. While planning the show, and still now, I'm inspired by the research, art, and writing around motherhood, and especially motherhood and the creative process. In the essay Work and Motherhood by psychoanalyst Dr. Jennifer Stewarts, she writes, "As analysts, we know that attachment and autonomy both are critically important to babies and to the adults who care for them. I made a series of objects with the recurring element of grips and handles. I was interested in gripping as one of the first instincts of a newborn that also has a function of attachment. All pieces consist of 2 handles or grip ends. Some play with irrational shapes, others with an intensity of the grip. And number 4 and 5 of the series explore the element of autonomy and separation, and I included stainless steel hardware to connect the 2 gripping ends of the pieces. In this one, I used a spring as an element of flexibility and tension. Here, a reference image of my daughter's arm folds that inspired the shape of the object. This one incorporates springs and quick releases as a symbol of physical separation. Throughout the works in the show, I used a new material, medical tubing. It has a metaphorical value to me as a passageway or an exchange of fluids or a connection between 2 physical spaces. And in this work, I was inspired by the way human organic tubes get tied and then adapted the tying technique for the tube ends of the object. While conceptualizing this show, the overturning of Roe happened. This moment created an impulse to add more complexity to a show that I mostly intended to be celebratory of newly entered motherhood. The political climate made me more outspoken about my own experiences, and I felt an urge to become more explicit with my subject matter. I made a sculptural diptych called Impregnator and Aborter and presented these tools on separate surgical dish-like structures. Impregnator has these 2 prominent handles that could be self-held or held by another. The clinical silver glazed shaft butts up directly to the organic fleshy looking part. The body in medicine is an interest of mine that I've been returning to for the past several years. The physical immediacy between organic matter and technological devices is what interests me particularly. But the title was also meant to highlight the act of impregnation and the two parties involved. A border, as the other part of the diptych, also has a handle that could be self-held or operated by another entity. The silver shape resembles the cervical dome on one side and a spiky, more aggressive component on the other. I wanted this instrument to appear as a makeshift device. The little wire loop was an attempt to emphasize the small surgical scale of the uterus and was also a nod to the symbol of the reproductive rights movement, the wire coat hanger. During the time of my exhibition, a New York Times article was published that included my work along several artists who addressed abortions in their work. The last piece of the show I'd like to discuss is titled Nourisher. As I mentioned before, medical tubing is a material I recently became interested in. I wanted to portray the body as a shared space, the mechanism of nourishment, intake, and outtake, and medical tubes come out of the figure's mouth and nipples and pool underneath on the mirror-polished stainless steel plate. Here, a photo of the making process. Here you see the glossy inside and the matte outside. The eyes of the face are pierced holes showing the residue of wet clay making way on the inside and outside of the eyes, a symbol of the gaze kind of going both ways from infant to mother and back. And the gaze brings us to the fifth and last project I'd like to present tonight. My first public sculpture titled Observer Observed from 2022, commissioned by the New York Highline. The piece came up in October 2022 and will remain on view until February of this year. It was commissioned by the Highline, and I worked closely with their team from determining the position all the way to the last final mechanical details. There's a viewing spurt on the Highline overlooking 26th Street. When receiving the invitation to do a project, I thought that this location was literally calling for an observatory platform. I knew I wanted to use the opportunity of a public art project to work on an interactive piece. Since my sculptures are usually marked by a body's absence and are extremely fragile, I was excited to go the other direction and create something that is activated by physical interaction and that would have to withstand weather and other environmental factors for several years. I collaborated with the technical engineer from the Highline, Jordan Banke, and with designer Casey Lurie. The observatory sculpture consists of a stainless steel stand, a height adjustment crank, and a bronze cast that houses binoculars and various technology inside the bronze cast. Inserted into the side of each lens cone is a little camera that captures the image of the viewer's eyes and live streams it to the adjacent LED screen. As you can see in the short video, the camera also transmits the abstracted image of the surroundings that is available when nobody's looking through the binoculars. In my works, eyes have always been obscured in different ways by cropping or covering or backlighting. And this work is the first one that explicitly centers eyes as an identifying feature. Discourses around voyeurism, the gaze, surveillance, anonymity, and the self-image in social media culture have posed questions for me, such as, what is the price of looking? And what's the price of a close-up, intimate, or inside view? Revealing the observer's identity is an attempt to add a transactional dimension to the gaze. And I'd like to close this presentation with a 3-minute excerpt of one of the last scenes of Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window from 1954. To give a bit of context for those who aren't familiar with the plot, Jeff, the protagonist, is confined to his apartment due to a leg accident that put him in a wheelchair temporarily. Over the course of several days, he observes the activities of his neighbor through binoculars and accidentally witnesses what appears to be a crime. In this closing scene, he reflects on his role as an observer in the company of his lover, Lisa.
Look.
He's kind of young, isn't he?
You know, much as I hate to give Thomas J. Doyle too much credit, he might have gotten a hold of something when he said that was pretty private stuff going on out there. I wonder if it's ethical to watch a man with binoculars and a long focus lens. Do you suppose it's ethical even if you prove that he didn't commit a crime?
I'm not much on Rear Window ethics.
Of course, they can do the same thing to me, watch me like a bug under a glass if they want to.
Jeff, you know, if someone came in here, they wouldn't believe what they'd see.
What?
You and me with long faces, plunged into despair because we find out a man didn't kill his wife. We're two of the most frightening ghouls I've ever known. You'd think we could be a little bit happy that the poor woman is alive and well. Whatever happened to that old saying, love thy neighbor?
You know, I think I'll start reviving that tomorrow. I'll begin with Miss Torso.
Not if I have to move into an apartment across the way and do the dance of the seven veils every hour. Show's over for tonight.
And that's it. Thank you very much.
Here we go. And now we have time for a few questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, just raise your hand.
Julia, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, your use of ceramic and commitment to it.
Yeah, I think the use has changed over the years. It started really with my fascination for taking casts, like partial casts of the body. And then when I developed this language of referencing tools and other functional devices, I also became interested in hand building. So I was no longer only taking casts, I was also, building structures at the same time. I'm just gonna try and go back in my slideshow to point to some examples. Almost there. In a piece like this was no longer about taking a cast, although the grip of the cane, for instance, is still technically a cast, but it was also about hand building. And, at the same time, I think metaphorically there's a value in ceramics that I really appreciate, which is the fragility. And because the works kind of invite a physical engagement because they borrow the language from functional objects that we touch, at the same time, there's this element of you cannot touch it, otherwise it will break. And I really like what that does. It kind of places the functionality in the viewer's imaginary in the sense that it's really not meant to be enacted. But that's also something that I was really happy then to break out of for the bronze work on the Highline.
Any other questions?
Oh, hi, Julia. So in that initial part of the presentation where it was working with relationships, did you choose the wrestler reference because you wanted to have a more combative reference?
Let me go back to that as well. It's that particular movement that I had in mind when I planned this circular stone base.
Oh, okay.
So I wanted to illustrate that, and also the tilt. The tilt in the two ceramic casts is not as drastic, but there is this kind of confrontational lean built into it that I was also trying to illustrate with this image.
Okay, thank you.
This was a really lovely talk. Thank you for speaking tonight. From what I've kind of observed, I'm really interested that it feels like there are kind of two different bodies inhabiting your practice. You have both the biopolitical, medicalized body, but also a living, breathing, spiritual and subjective body. And both of those feel in some ways politically at odds with one another in how we inhabit the world, both as individuals, but as a collective subjects with collective consequences. And I was wondering how you reconcile that in the work from both like an intellectual and political position.
I'm not sure if I do, and my question is, do you want to write about my work?
Always, yeah, would happily do that.
Hi. Very quick question. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the floor, the pedestals, this one that's up right now, and then the ones from the biennial. And I don't know, I go to like figure and ground, of course, because there's these kind of absented bodies. But I'm wondering if you could, speak a little bit more about the floors that you make for the work. Maybe that's not the right
You mean
term.
the stone bases particularly?
Yeah, the bases, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so the stone entered my practice for this show that you see right now. And in that show, I was referencing also institutional spaces. So the work that I discussed called Negotiator, for instance, I was thinking about, negotiations and how they can take place and where they take place, for instance, in institutional settings. So especially in the context of Chicago and, the architecture here and all of these, impressive stone lobbies, I was using both granite and marble as a reference to that. Same with Mediator. And then I think, I just became more comfortable with stone, and that's why I brought it into my next body of work. But even there, going back to the little intro that I gave about the churches, I'm still referencing these spaces that are also institutions, just of a different kind. So it has that meaning to me. But then maybe on a more, maybe crafty level, I think stone and ceramics are in beautiful harmony with one another. They have quite similar qualities, in terms of their hardness or the way that you can finish them. Even just touch, like imagining the touch of stone and the temperature of it kind of resembles ceramics. And there's also a similar element that is a lack of control. So in ceramics, you can control a lot, but also there is so much that you simply cannot control in the process of firing. And it's similar with stone, that the veining you just can't control. You can choose what's available, but you can't make the stone, and that's something I appreciate.
I think we have time for one more question.
So sort of on theme of the last question, there's obviously a lot of design to the work. You shout out a specific person, Casey Lurie. So in relation to other baby fabricators or people working on the work, why specifically note that person? And what is the nature of how that relationship works as a collaboration with a furniture designer?
Yeah. Casey Lurie is my partner. And I know his work and his mind very intimately. And he understands me very deeply.
Makes sense why you'd shout him out then.
Okay, last question right here.
Yeah, I was just curious when I was watching the people with your video piece, which to me is a pretty big deviation in the feeling of it. How do you feel about watching people interact with that piece versus the other parts of your practice, which I think have a very different feeling?
Do you mean the first one, the audio installation, or the one on the Highline?
The eyes on the Highline.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. I wasn't there. I didn't take that video, but I've visited the Highline and have watched people, and it's not uncomfortable or anything. I think watching people interact just shows me aspects about the work that I wasn't aware of. So, for instance, what I was not aware of is that it would become such a magnet for selfies, or even not just selfies, but like asking somebody to take a photo of you while looking through them and then having your eyes on display. So that added like a whole new element to the work, kind of, like TikTok ready work. I was not aware that I was gonna make a TikTok ready work. And other than that, to me, it's very pleasant, actually, that finally, people can touch it without me being anxious. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for such a generous, wonderful evening, for sharing yourself and your beautifully complex and lyrical artwork with us this evening.
Thank you very much.